Biker grabs Waitress by her hair until Chuck Norris gets up. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. The bell above Ruby's grill jingled softly as the morning sun spilled through the windows. Outside, the dusty streets of the small town were just beginning to stir, but inside the diner, the day had already started hours ago. The scent of bacon, coffee, and maple syrup clung to the air like memory. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, where the world still felt safe, at least on most days. Lucy moved gracefully between tables, though there was a tiredness in her step. She was in her early 30s, hair tied up in a loose ponytail, apron slightly stained from batter and coffee. She had the kind of face that carried both kindness and exhaustion, like someone who had been holding too much for too long. Yet every customer she greeted received a warm smile, as if they were the most important person she'd see all day. Her name tag was slightly crooked, her sneakers worn at the soles, but she never complained. Not when the coffee machine sputtered, not when the grill acted up, and certainly not when she remembered that rent was due in 3 days and the tip jar still looked half empty. Behind the counter, Frank, the diner's grumpy but lovable owner, flipped through an old newspaper. He was in his 60s, thick glasses, a permanent scowl, and a secret heart of gold. He never said it, but Lucy was the soul of this place, and he knew it. "Lucy," he muttered without looking up, "if you move any faster, you're going to turn into a blur. Sit for a second before you pass out." She smiled, pouring another cup of coffee for a regular customer. "If I sit, I might not get back up." The diner was full of the usual morning faces. Jared, the young mailman, was telling some story about a dog who kept stealing people's mail. An elderly couple by the window argued lovingly over toast. A teenager in a hoodie scrolled through his phone while pretending not to be listening. And then, in the farthest booth, half shadowed by the blinds, sat a man who hadn't spoken a word. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with a weathered face and a quiet intensity. He wore a denim jacket, boots that had seen more miles than most cars, and beside him, a worn-out cowboy hat rested on the seat. He was still, almost too still, like a stone in the middle of a running river. Nobody paid him much attention. Not really, but Lucy noticed him. He'd been coming in for the last few days, always early, always ordering the same thing, black coffee, 2 slices of toast. He never finished the toast. She approached his table with the pot. "Warm up?" she asked gently. He didn't say anything, just lifted his cup slightly, allowing her to pour. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments. His gaze was calm, but piercing, the kind of look that made you feel like he saw more than what was in front of him. She gave him a small nod and moved on. Something about him made her uneasy, but not in a threatening way. It was more like gravity. He pulled your attention, even in silence. Back at the kitchen window, she picked up 2 plates and glanced up at the small photo pinned above the pass-through. A boy, maybe 8 years old, beaming with a smile, missing his front teeth. Her son. Next to it, a crumpled school flyer. Music class fundraiser, $125 needed. She sighed, then balanced the plates on her arm and headed back out. The morning rolled on. Coffee was poured, orders taken. A toddler spilled cereal. Frank muttered under his breath about kids these days. The world kept spinning. But Chuck, for that was the quiet man's name, though no one in the diner knew it yet, didn't move. He didn't need to. His eyes flicked now and then, catching every detail. The way Lucy winced when she reached too far. How she counted every bill before slipping it into her apron. The smile that never quite reached her eyes. He saw her, not just with his eyes, but with the understanding of someone who'd seen a lot of people hide their pain behind practice smiles. Outside, the distant growl of a motorcycle broke the peace. It was faint at first, like a warning on the wind, but it grew louder, closer, angrier. Inside the diner, conversation faded just a little. People paused. Jared glanced toward the door. Even Frank lowered his paper. Lucy froze for a moment, her hand resting on the counter. Something in the sound made her skin crawl. Chuck's hand shifted around his coffee cup. Barely, but enough. The motorcycle's engine roared into the parking lot and stopped with a violent screech. For a few seconds, Silence hung in the diner like a hell breath. Then the door swung open, and the bell above it screamed instead of jingled. A storm had arrived. But no one, not even the man who walked in, knew yet that he had just stepped into the last diner he'd ever disrespect. Chapter 2. The threat arrives. The man who stepped through the diner door might as well have been a thunderclap in human form. He was tall, broad, and loud, not just in the sound of his boots stomping across the tile, but in the way he moved, like he owned the place before even looking around. His leather vest was stained with engine grease and cigarette ash. Tattoos curled around his arms like snakes, and mirrored sunglasses covered eyes that didn't need to see clearly to intimidate. He didn't nod, didn't greet, just took space. A thick cloud of silence followed him in, heavy and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence. Jared, the mailman, cleared his throat but said nothing. The elderly couple by the window looked down at their plates. Even Frank leaned, just slightly back in his seat behind the counter. But Lucy, ever composed, greeted him like she would anyone else. "Morning," she said. "Coffee." The biker didn't answer right away. He slid into the booth closest to the middle of the diner, where everyone could see him, and grinned. It wasn't a friendly grin. It was the kind that dared someone to flinch. "Coffee," he muttered. "Hot. Black. Don't make it weak." Lucy gave a tight nod and turned to pour, but even that small interaction had shifted the room. Chuck, still in his corner, lifted his eyes just slightly. He didn't stare. He didn't move. But he watched. The biker, Grizz, his patch red, leaned back, arms stretched wide across the seat, like he was measuring the diner with his chest. He picked up a menu and scoffed at it. $7 for pancakes? This dump must think it's 5 stars. No one responded. Lucy brought the coffee and set it down gently. "Let me know when you're ready to order." "Sweetheart," Grizz said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I ain't never been ready for anything that costs more than a 6-pack and bad decisions." A few uncomfortable chuckles came from a booth near the window, but Lucy just turned away, biting the inside of her cheek. Grizz watched her go. His grin widened. It didn't take long before he started stirring things up. First, he knocked over the napkin holder with a careless swipe. Then he snapped his fingers for a refill before even tasting the first cup. When Frank asked him to be a little more respectful, Grizz just laughed in his face. "What are you going to do, old man? Throw a spatula at me?" Frank didn't answer. He just disappeared into the back, pretending to check on the grill. Chuck sipped his coffee. Calm. Still. But his eyes had changed. Just slightly. Minutes passed like hours. Then Grizz stood up. He walked around like he was inspecting the place, like he was choosing his next target. He approached Jared, stole a piece of bacon off his plate, and called it payment for breathing his air. Jared didn't resist. He just looked at Lucy with a silent help me in his eyes. Lucy stepped in. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat." Grizz turned toward her like a shark catching scent. "You don't ask me anything, sweetheart. You serve. That's your job, isn't it?" Her jaw clenched. "Please sit down." He stepped forward, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You got a mouth on you," he said. "Bet it gets you in trouble." Chuck set his coffee down. The sound was quiet, barely a clink, but somehow it cut through the room louder than Grizz's voice. No one dared to move. Lucy didn't back down. She crossed her arms, trying not to let him see the way her hands shook. "Sit down." Grizz laughed, a real guttural, mocking laugh. Then he reached out and flicked the edge of her apron like she was a toy. "You really think you're in charge here?" He turned away, heading back to his table, but only to grab something. A toothpick, a lighter, maybe a weapon. No one could tell. But what happened next would burn itself into the memory of everyone in that diner. He turned back to Lucy, and without warning, without even a full word, he grabbed her by the hair and yanked her toward him. The room froze. Gasps. Forks clattered. Someone stood halfway, then sank back down. Lucy's eyes welled with tears, not from pain, though there was pain, but from something deeper. Humiliation, violation, anger. She struggled, trying to pull away, but Grizz held fast, sneering into her face. "Should have been nicer, sweetheart," he hissed. "Maybe I'd have left a tip." Chuck stood. He didn't shout. didn't slam his fists or throw a chair. He just stood, slowly, silently, like a mountain rising from the earth. His movements were calm, controlled, but there was power in them, the kind that made the air heavier, like a storm about to break. The diner went still again. Every eye turned to him. Grizz barely glanced over. "What's this? The senior patrol?" Chuck's voice was low, quiet, but somehow it cut like a blade. "Let her go." Grizz chuckled, not loosening his grip. "Old man," he said, "you've got about 3 seconds before I turn you into soup." Chuck took a step forward. "Just one," I said. He repeated, slower now. "Let her go." The way he said it made something inside Grizz falter for a split second, like a dog hearing a sound it didn't recognize. His grip loosened just slightly. Lucy used that moment to pull away. She stumbled backward, hand to her head, breath shaky but free. Grizz turned fully toward Chuck now, shoulders squared. "You want to be a hero, huh? You're going to regret that." But Chuck didn't respond. He simply stood there, tall, quiet, ready. And everyone in the room knew. The silence was about to be broken in the most unforgettable way. Chapter 3. Setback. The tension in the diner wrapped itself around everyone like a vice. Grizz stood with his chest puffed out, hands clenched into fists, the smirk on his face growing wider by the second. He was used to people backing down, used to folks avoiding eye contact, pretending not to hear. That's how bullies survived, by being louder than fear. But Chuck didn't flinch. He stood calm, still as stone, eyes fixed on Grizz. There was no anger in his face, no panic, just the quiet, measured presence of a man who had seen too much and wouldn't tolerate even 1 second more. Lucy backed away slowly, rubbing her scalp where the biker had grabbed her. She was still trembling, but the relief in her eyes was visible. Chuck had stepped in. Someone had finally stood up. But Grizz wasn't used to people like Chuck. He tilted his head, as if sizing him up. "You're a tough guy, huh?" he growled, stepping closer. "I've broken ribs for less than the look you're giving me." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't have to. Silence was his weapon, and it was starting to rattle Grizz in a way no words ever could. Grizz's knuckles cracked as he balled up his fists. "Say something," he shouted. "You think I'm afraid of some old man?" Chuck blinked, slowly. Then, finally he spoke. "No, I think you're afraid of what happens when people stop being afraid of you." That line landed like a slap across the face. The few people brave enough to watch held their breath. Even Frank peeked his head out from the kitchen, eyes wide. Grizz's nostrils flared. "Big talk. You got one move, old man. One." He lunged forward, shoving Chuck hard with both hands. Chuck stepped back half an inch. That was it. And when Grizz saw that the shove didn't even shake him, that the man hadn't even raised his hands, something changed in his expression. The confidence cracked. Just a little, but enough. Chuck looked down at the biker's hands. "You like using those hands to hurt people?" he asked quietly. "What did you say?" Grizz snapped, stepping in again. Chuck raised his eyes. They were different now, like the lights inside him had turned on. "I said," Chuck repeated, slower this time, "do you like hurting people who can't fight back?" Grizz snorted. "You think you can fight back?" Chuck didn't answer, but everyone in that diner already knew. Grizz pulled back his arm, cocked it wide, and swung with everything he had. The punch tore through the air, but hit nothing. Chuck had already moved. One step to the side, effortless. Grizz stumbled forward as his own momentum betrayed him. And then, Chuck's elbow drove into Grizz's ribs with a crack that echoed off the walls. The biker howled in pain, staggered, turned, only to catch a boot to the knee that dropped him like a tower crumbling into dust. He reached out wildly, trying to grab Chuck's jacket. But Chuck grabbed first. A clean grip on the wrist, a twist, and Grizz was face down on the floor, arm pinned behind him, gasping like a man who'd just been dragged underwater. The diner was silent again, but not in fear. This silence was awe. No one had even seen Chuck move. 1 second he was still, and the next Grizz was on the ground, groaning, muttering curses between clenched teeth. Chuck looked down at him. "You walk into quiet places like this thinking no one's going to stop you," he said, voice low and steady. "You prey on kindness, on small towns, on people who have better things to do than fight. Grizz writhed, trying to pull away, but Chuck's grip didn't budge. You didn't expect anyone to stand up to you, Chuck continued. You certainly didn't expect me. He leaned closer. I'm your consequence. With a final twist, he released the biker, letting him drop flat to the tile. Grizz groaned and curled up, holding his side, coughing. Chuck straightened his jacket, then turned. He walked back to his table. Calm. Still. Like nothing had happened. Lucy stood near the counter, tears shining in her eyes. Not from pain this time, but something deeper. Something like gratitude. Something like justice. She stepped forward, still shaky. Thank you, she whispered. Chuck nodded once. You didn't deserve that. No one does. The front door swung open again, this time less violently. The sheriff entered, clearly having heard the call. He looked down at Grizz on the ground, then up at Chuck. They locked eyes. The sheriff had known Chuck once. Long ago. You could see it in the look that passed between them. A kind of recognition that didn't need words. The sheriff let out a sigh. Same story, he asked. Chuck gave a small shrug. Just coffee. The sheriff turned to his deputy. Get this guy out of here. As the biker was dragged to his feet, groaning and limping, Chuck sat back down at his booth. Lucy refilled his cup, her hand still a little shaky, but stronger now. It's on the house, she said softly. Chuck didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. Outside, Grizz was loaded into the back of the squad car, defeated and humiliated. He didn't even look back at the diner. Inside, the small-town world slowly started turning again. Forks clinked. Coffee poured. Conversations resumed. But something had changed. The people of that diner would remember this morning for the rest of their lives. Not because of the violence or the fear, but because for once, someone stood up. Someone who didn't raise his voice. Someone who didn't need a badge or a title. Someone who just got up when it mattered most. Chapter 4. When the dust settles. The sirens faded into the distance as the sheriff's car carried Grizz away, his ego bruised far worse than his body. Inside Ruby's grill, things had returned to normal, at least on the surface. But the energy had shifted. It was quieter now, not silent like before the fight, not fearful, but humbled, reverent, like everyone was still processing what they'd just seen, letting the moment settle into the corners of their memory. Chuck sat alone in his booth again, just like before. The only difference was the subtle way people looked at him now. Curious, respectful, grateful. Even Frank, who rarely said anything outside his usual sarcasm, gave a silent nod of acknowledgement from behind the counter. Lucy stood at the coffee machine, pouring from a fresh pot, her hands steadier now. She'd washed her face in the back and tied her hair up tighter, but her cheeks still held the redness of what had happened. She caught her reflection in the metal surface of the machine. She didn't see a victim. She saw someone still standing. She turned and walked back over to Chuck's table, this time without hesitation. She refilled his cup, not because it needed it. He'd barely touched the first one, but because something in her told her she needed to. Chuck looked up at her. His expression was soft now, less guarded than before. The sharpness was still there. It always would be. But beneath, it was something more human. Tired, maybe, or just done with watching the world go unchecked. Lucy pulled out the opposite chair and sat down slowly. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Chuck sipped his coffee, then placed the cup down. You're right. I didn't have to. But I'm not the kind of man who sits and watches while someone gets hurt. Lucy studied him for a moment. You've done things like that before. It wasn't a question. Chuck gave a slow nod. Too many times. There was a pause between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. The kind of pause where two people are measuring weight that can't be seen. Lucy leaned back. You're not from here. No, Chuck replied. Just passing through? That's usually how it goes. She nodded slowly, then looked down at her hands. I've worked here for 10 years. Raised my boy on tips and night shifts. Never asked for help. Never needed it. Her voice cracked slightly just once. Until today. Chuck didn't speak, but the way he looked at her, the way he listened, was enough. People like him, she continued, they always act like they can do whatever they want. Like no one's going to stop them. And most of the time, no one does. Chuck's eyes darkened slightly. That's what they count on. Lucy looked out the window at the now empty parking lot. You know the saddest part? I didn't even think anyone would step in. Not because people here are bad, but because they're scared, tired, just trying to survive. She turned back to him. But you did. Chuck gave a quiet nod. I've seen what happens when people don't stand up, he said. I've seen good folks suffer while the loud ones walk free. I don't have much left to give this world, but I can still give that. Another pause. Then Lucy leaned in slightly, voice softer now. Who are you? Chuck gave the faintest smile, the kind you only see once and remember forever. Just a man with good coffee taste and a low tolerance for bullies. Lucy laughed quietly, the tension finally breaking from her shoulders. Frank approached the table slowly, holding a small envelope. Sheriff left this, he said, sliding it toward Chuck. Said to pass it on. Chuck opened it. Inside was a business card, plain, official, with a handwritten note on the back. Appreciate what you did. Still got a room if you need one. Mike. Chuck nodded, then tucked the card into his pocket without a word. Frank hesitated. You planning on sticking around? Chuck looked out the window. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the floor. Long enough, he said. Frank didn't ask what that meant. He just clapped Chuck lightly on the shoulder and walked off. Lucy said a moment longer. Then, you ever get tired of being the one who has to stand up? Chuck's eyes held hers. Every day. She smiled gently. But you do it anyway. Because someone has to. Outside, a few kids rode by on their bikes. A man watered the flowers in front of his hardware store. The world kept turning. Inside the diner, the clatter of plates and soft chatter returned like a slow heartbeat. Life, stubborn and beautiful, always found a way back. Lucy stood, smoothing her apron. Well, she said with a smile, your coffee's getting cold. Chuck looked down at the cup. It always does. And for the first time that morning, Lucy saw him smile. Not a smirk, not a mask, but something genuine. Quiet. Earned. She left him to his peace and walked away, lighter now than when the day began. The man who had walked into her diner unnoticed had become the reason she still believed in good people. And though Chuck would never say it out loud, he didn't just save a moment. He helped restore something much deeper. Hope. Chapter 5. The Price of Peace. The diner began to breathe again, like a chest rising after being held tight for too long. Conversation returned in soft waves. Plates clinked. Coffee poured. The world stitched itself back together with every ordinary sound. But even as peace returned to Ruby's grill, the weight of what had happened hadn't fully lifted. Not for Chuck. Not for Lucy. Not for anyone who'd seen the way things could have gone if just one person had looked away. Chuck sat alone, still in the same booth. His coffee had long since gone cold, but he hadn't asked for a new cup. He wasn't drinking it for the warmth. He was drinking it for the ritual, the silence between moments, the calm before the next storm. Outside, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting sharper shadows. Trucks rumbled in the distance. Life in the small town pushed on, pretending like nothing had happened. But something had. Something important. Lucy was back to work, but her eyes kept drifting toward the corner booth, toward the man who had changed the air in the room with nothing but a calm voice and an unshakable presence. She still didn't know who he was, not really, but part of her hoped he wouldn't leave just yet. Chuck reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo, creased and weathered, edges torn like a memory that had been folded too many times. It showed a younger man, a boy, smiling, laughing. There was sun behind him. Trees. Peace. He looked at it for a long time, then slid it back into his jacket. From across the room, Frank approached, not with the sarcasm he usually wore like armor, but with quiet respect. You got people? He asked gently. Chuck didn't look up. Used to. Frank nodded, not prying. You staying in town? Don't know yet. Well, Frank scratched the back of his neck, awkward now. If you are, you eat free here. For life. Chuck glanced up. That's generous. Not generosity, Frank replied. Gratitude. Chuck gave the faintest nod, then turned back toward the window. Just then, the door opened again, that old bell jingling like it always did, and in walked someone new. A young man, late 20s, short hair, sheriff's badge on his chest. But he wasn't smiling. Chuck watched him quietly. The deputy looked around, then made his way to the counter where Lucy stood. He spoke softly, just low enough that the rest of the diner wouldn't catch every word. Except Chuck did. "Lucy, I hate to ask this after what you've been through, but we've got a problem." She tensed instantly. "What kind of problem?" He sighed. "That biker. Grizz. He's not just some random drifter. He's part of a crew." Lucy's blood ran cold. "Outlaws?" she asked. The deputy nodded. "He's not high-ranking, but he's connected." And words already spread about what happened here. Lucy glanced over at Chuck. He was still seated, still calm, but now watching her intently. "They think he's dead?" she asked. "No, but humiliated? Definitely. That kind of guy doesn't take kindly to being beaten, especially not in front of witnesses." Her voice dropped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there might be more coming. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe 20 minutes from now." Lucy stepped back, heart racing. The deputy tried to reassure her. "We're keeping eyes on the roads. The sheriff's bringing in backup. But I just wanted you to know. Be careful. Lock up early. Stay alert." She nodded slowly. "Thanks, Josh." He left the card on the counter and walked out, tipping his hat at Frank and giving Chuck a subtle look as he passed. The kind of look that said, "We both know what's coming, don't we?" Chuck sat still, but the moment the door closed, Lucy came straight over to him. "You heard?" He nodded once. She hesitated, then sat across from him again. "You think they'll come?" Chuck didn't answer right away. Then, "People like that don't care about the law. They only care about pride." Lucy's hands were clenched in her lap. "I can't go through this again. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not every time someone like him walks through those doors." Chuck looked at her. "You won't." She stared back. "But you won't be here forever." Chuck's jaw tightened. The quiet between them deepened. He wasn't a man who made promises easily. Not anymore. But he saw the fear behind her eyes. He saw the same fear he'd seen in other places. Other people. People he hadn't gotten to in time. And this time he had. This time he could stay. "I'll be here," he said finally. "If they come, they'll regret it." Tears welled in Lucy's eyes. Not of sadness, but of release. She nodded. Chuck glanced out the window. A dust cloud in the far distance. Maybe just a truck. Maybe not. Time was running out. The storm wasn't over. What happened with Grizz was just the spark. The fire was still coming. But this time, they wouldn't face it alone. Chuck Norris was awake now, and he wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 6, When Legends Rise. The sun was starting to dip now, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of the town. The golden haze stretched across rooftops and flickered through the blinds of Ruby's grill. But the light inside felt colder than it should have, like the calm before something sharp, something loud. Chuck hadn't left his booth. He sat there, the same way he had that morning. Quiet, still, watching. Only now, people looked to him differently. With hope, with weight. Like somehow, his stillness held back the world outside. Lucy had locked the door early. The sign flipped to closed, but the lights remained on. She was still inside, clearing plates, trying to act like her hands weren't shaking. Frank stood near the counter, pretending to wipe things down, but really just keeping one eye on the window. Jared, the mailman, had offered to stay. He sat at the far booth, pale but willing. The diner wasn't just a diner tonight. It was a line in the sand, and they all knew it. Outside, that dust cloud from earlier had grown bigger. Now, there was no doubt. It wasn't a single truck. It was motorcycles. 4 of them. Engines snarling like wolves coming home to a kill. The vibrations hit the ground first, like distant thunder. Then the lights came into view. Headlights. Leather jackets. Grim determination. Chuck stood up, slow and deliberate. Lucy flinched at the sound of the chair legs scraping the floor. He looked toward the window, where the headlights now cut through the glass. "They're here," Frank whispered. Jared looked ready to bolt, but Chuck simply walked toward the door. He stopped just before it and turned back to Lucy. "Lock it behind me." "You're going out there?" she asked, hard in her throat. He nodded. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said. And with that, he opened the door and stepped into the fading light. The air outside had changed. It wasn't just wind and exhaust. It was heavy, charged, like the world itself was holding its breath. The motorcycles were already parked in a line out front, engines still running, exhaust snaking into the air. The riders stood around them, heavy boots crunching gravel, arms crossed. All of them wore the same patch, a snarling wolf's head, teeth bared. At the center of the group stood Crowley, older than the rest, lean, eyes like knives. The kind of man who'd been broken once and decided to break the world in return. He looked Chuck up and down with a sneer. "You the old boy who laid hands on one of mine?" Chuck didn't answer, just stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the porch. Crowley motioned to one of the younger bikers, a brute with tattoos up to his throat, who dropped a metal pipe to the ground. It clanged like a warning bell. "You made Grizz look weak," Crowley said. "Now we make you disappear." Chuck gave a slow breath. His voice, when it came, was almost too calm. "If you want to fight, don't bring 4 of you. Bring 40. The bikers chuckled, the kind of laugh that came before violence. "Arrogant. Hollow. You're going to regret that," one of them spat. Crowley raised his hand, and the first one lunged. Chuck moved like wind meeting fire. One step to the side, one arm up, and the biker hit the gravel before he even knew what happened. A twist, a punch, and he didn't get back up. The next one came swinging the pipe, a wide, heavy arc. Chuck ducked low, drove his shoulder into the man's gut, then sent him flying over the hood of his own bike. The third tried to grab him from behind. A mistake. Chuck twisted, elbow to the ribs, knee to the face. Blood sprayed like a warning flare. The entire fight lasted under 15 seconds. 3 men down. None of them saw it coming. Only Crowley remained. And he didn't laugh. He pulled a switchblade slowly from his belt, the silver flashing in the last sliver of sun. "You think you're something special?" Crowley snarled. Chuck tilted his head slightly. "I don't think." He stepped forward. Crowley slashed. Chuck caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted it until the knife dropped, then drove a single punch into his chest, so precise, so final, that Crowley crumpled like a man hit by a train no one saw coming. Silence. Only the whimpering of broken men lying in the dirt. Engines cooling. Boots scraping as bikers try to crawl away from the quiet man who had just dismantled all of them. Chuck looked around. Anyone else? No one moved. From the window, Lucy watched with both hands over her mouth. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was in awe. But inside that awe was something deeper. A shift. A reckoning. It wasn't just what Chuck had done. It was how he'd done it. Without rage. Without chaos. Just calm, deliberate resolve. Even Jared, who had almost run earlier, now sat frozen in place, whispering, "Did you see that?" to no one in particular. Inside the diner, the clock ticked on the wall. Outside, Chuck turned and walked back toward the diner, brushing dust from his jacket like it was just another Tuesday. Frank unlocked the door. Inside, no one said a word for a long moment. Finally, Lucy stepped forward. "Why do you do it?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "Why keep fighting when the world's so tired of fighting?" Chuck looked at her with those eyes, the kind that held war and peace at once. "Because if we stop standing up, then people like them think they've won." She nodded slowly, and in that quiet, a kind of peace settled over the room. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of strength. Chuck sat back down at his booth, and this time, when Lucy brought him coffee, her hands were steady. Chapter 7. Resolution. The quiet after the storm. Morning came quietly in the little town, slower than usual, softer somehow, as if even the sunrise knew something had changed. Ruby's Grill opened later that day, not because it had to, but because Frank and Lucy want to clean up, sweep the dust from the floor, put the chairs back in place, throw out a shattered sugar jar from the night before. There wasn't much left behind. No blood, no broken bones inside, just the memory of what had happened. And the story. Everyone in town was talking. About the man who took down 4 bikers without breaking a sweat. About how he stood calm while violence stormed around him. About how he walked away like it was just another moment in his life. Chuck didn't say goodbye. He never did. When Lucy arrived that morning, she found the booth in the far corner empty, the seat cushions still indented, the coffee cup clean, and a folded $20 bill under the plate of toast he'd never touched. But there was something else, too. A note, written in simple, steady handwriting. No signature, just 2 lines. "Don't let fear in. And if it knocks, you know what to do." She read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then folded it neatly and placed it in her apron pocket, right next to the photo of her son. Outside, the day moved on. People drove by, some slowing down just to look at the diner, wondering if the man might still be sitting in that booth. But he wasn't. He was gone, like a breeze that stirred everything up, then disappeared before anyone could thank it. Jared, the mailman, came by with flowers. Frank shook his head and grumbled, but he put them in a clean glass and set them on the counter. Someone else dropped off a new jukebox, didn't say who paid for it. But Lucy knew. Later that afternoon, the sheriff returned. Just like Chuck, he didn't say much. Just stepped inside, scanned the place, and smiled. There were no more questions. No reports. Just peace. And a quiet understanding. Chuck wasn't coming back. Because he didn't need to. He had done what he came to do. But the real change? It wasn't the silence. It was what came after. Frank put up a new sign on the diner's wall. "You're safe here." It wasn't flashy. Just handwritten with thick black marker. But people noticed. And somehow, it made the coffee taste warmer. Lucy began to walk taller. Her smile was still soft, but it came easier now. And when customers asked about him, she just smiled. He's just someone who listens when no one else will. Word spread, not just about what happened, but about the feeling it left behind. A woman from 2 towns over came in just to sit in Chuck's booth. A man from the city left a note under his plate that read, "Thank you for reminding me not to be silent." People started tipping better. They held the door open longer. They stood up just a little straighter when things didn't feel right. Not because Chuck told them to, but because he showed them how. Days later, the sun dipped low again. Golden light spilled across the red booths. Customers filled the diner, laughing, eating, living. The world moved forward. Lucy stood behind the counter, a little straighter now, a little stronger. She smiled at people without faking it. She laughed without forcing it. And when a stranger walked through the door, big, loud, wearing sunglasses indoors, she didn't flinch. She smiled, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and said, calmly, "You can sit wherever you like." Because she knew now, if fear ever came back through that door, if darkness ever tried to grab hold again, she wouldn't be alone, even if he wasn't there anymore. The legend of Chuck Norris never really leaves.